Right, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star. And Temple of the Silver Star is a modern mystery school working in the Thelemic and Golden Dawn traditions. And we offer structured training in the mystical and magical practices of Thelema and the Golden Dawn tradition. And if you're interested in learning more about Temple of the Silver Star, what we do, or submitting an application for membership, I'll give you some contact information at the end of this presentation. So welcome. This is the first class in our 7-part class series on astrological magic. So we'll be meeting every other Sunday from now until whatever the second Sunday in May is. I think May 9th. So yeah, we'll be meeting every other week. Yeah, so let's just get right into it. We've got a lot to get through today. All right, so before we get into the meat of the material today, I just wanted to start with just a sort of broad sense of some of the tradition and where we're coming from with all of this. This is an image here of Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary sage of Egypt and Hellenistic Egypt. And Hermes Trismegistus is the source of a lot of wisdom and philosophical teachings, as well as practical teachings in the what are called the 3 Hermetic arts of magic, astrology, and alchemy. And so in our class series today, we won't really be talking about alchemy, but we're going to be talking a lot about both magic and astrology. So I thought Hermes was a good kind of patron figure for our series here today. Of course, the tradition has evolved a lot, in the few thousand years that it's been around. But, we still consider ourselves, part of this tradition and as, modern, contemporary, Hermetic magicians. So in addition to what are called the technical Hermetica, the practical writings on magic, the practices of magic, astrology, and alchemy, you also have the philosophical Hermetica, largely consisting of the Corpus Hermeticum, as well as a few other texts that give the philosophical Hermetic teachings on cosmology and theology and philosophy. So this is a quote here from the book 16 or chapter 16, section 16 of the Corpus Hermeticum. And this is Asclepius, who in the Corpus Hermeticum, Asclepius is one of the disciples of Hermes Trismegistus. And here he's instructing the king Ammon. And so he says, just a word here, a couple words before we jump into the quote. God will be spoken about here, and masculine pronouns will be used. But the Corpus Hermeticum is quite clear that God contains both genders, although they, as our culture has continued to do, often uses the masculine as the default, and as we're sort of just now, I think, stopping. But the idea of God here is something beyond, any single gender. All right, so the quote. The intelligible cosmos, then, depends from God, and the sensible cosmos from the intelligible. But the sun, through the intelligible cosmos and the sensible as well, the sensible cosmos would be like, what we would call like the physical universe, that which can be apprehended by the senses, and the intelligible is that which can be, apprehended by the mind. If you think of like the Platonic forms, these ideas like, unity and multiplicity, or limited and unlimited, these types of ideas are the intelligible, right? So let's see, where were we? The intelligible cosmos then depends from God, and the sensible cosmos from the intelligible. But the sun, through the intelligible cosmos and the sensible as well, is supplied by God with the influx of good, with his craftsmanship, in other words. Around the sun are the 8 spheres that depend from it. This is interesting. Unlike a lot of the other Corpus Hermeticum texts, this is actually using a heliocentric model, where we're putting the sun at the center and the other spheres around it, which is very interesting. The sphere of the fixed stars, the 6 of the planets, and the one that surrounds the earth. From these spheres depend the demons. Now, demons here just means spirits. We're not talking about, something evil here. This is like daimones, right? From these spheres depend the demons, and then from the demons, humans. And thus all things and all persons are dependent from God. Therefore, the Father of all is God, their craftsman is the sun, and the cosmos is the instrument of craftsmanship. Intelligible essence governs heaven. Heaven governs the gods, and demons posted by the gods govern humans. This is the army of gods and demons. Through them, God makes everything for himself, and all things are parts of God. But if all things are parts of God, then all things are God, and he makes himself in making all things. His making can never cease because he is ceaseless. And as God has no end, so his making has neither beginning nor end. So this was a nice quote just to start us off and remind us that this tradition is coming out of a view of the universe that is, it's a vast, cosmic view. We're talking not just about terrestrial powers, but the celestial powers as well. And it's full of spirit and intelligence, and the entire cosmos is, the whole of it is sacred and interconnected and, pervaded by soul and by intelligence. So I just thought this was a nice thing to start us off with. And I think we'll also see throughout this series the theme of unity and multiplicity. And we'll talk about that a few times today, that although there's a variety of celestial powers and spirits and angels and gods, they're all interconnected and interdependent, and ultimately are one unified, living organic thing. All right, so just a few preliminary notes here about this entire series. First thing, now hexagram rituals as well as astrological magic are included in the Temple of Silver Stars training, both in our academic and in our initiatory tracks. If you are a member of Temple of the Silver Star, either academic or initiatory track, it's perfectly fine to experiment with the hexagram rituals and some of the things we're going to talk about here. But we don't recommend that you incorporate these into your regular ongoing practice until the time that they're actually formally assigned to you. We have a structured training that goes in a specific order, for specific reasons. So again, it's perfectly fine to experiment with this stuff no matter where you are. These things are a little bit advanced. They're considered more advanced than pentagram rituals. So some people may find that if you're newer to this and maybe not quite ready for this stuff, there's nothing to be worried about. The thing you really risk in doing these things before you're ready is that nothing will happen. So if you are doing some of these hexagram rituals and things like that and not really getting any results, it's great to get that experience early on. Like in the AA training, for example, probationers really experiment with the entire range of techniques. Even though they're not expected to get any results from them, they get a kind of preliminary survey of the entire curriculum, and then enter a more step-by-step training. So in that spirit, it's perfectly fine, to experiment with all this stuff and to try it out, and that can be really helpful. Though again, if you're not getting a lot of results, or if you're a formal member and you haven't yet been assigned this stuff, when you come back later, you may see that you get actual results or much better or more vivid results. So just something to pay attention to. Also, with some of the material that we'll be looking at today and going forward, these will be the public versions of this material, and we do also have a number of initiated teachings, and I'll point out one or two places where this is the case, but just do be aware, especially if you're like an initiate and haven't gotten to the place where this stuff is taught, just be aware that some of the initiated versions of these rituals and teachings are somewhat different than we're presenting publicly. Though, of course, the public rituals and all that stuff are perfectly effective in their own right. They're not missing anything. I'm not presenting blinds or anything like that. We just have special forms of many of these things for initiates. Also, we're not going to talk too much about astrology today, but in the weeks going forward, we are going to talk a bunch about astrology. So a few words about astrological traditions. Temple of the Silver Star, for its members, does not dictate what forms of astrology you practice. That's completely up to you. And we really encourage people to do some research and look at the various traditions out there, to try things out and to figure out what works for you and what you want to practice. So the first thing here is we have the distinction between tropical and sidereal astrology. If you're not familiar with this distinction, I recommend you go take a look at it. It's not particularly complicated, but it would take more time to explain than I really wanted to do here. So that's something you could look up. So again, Temple of Silver Star takes no official position about tropical versus sidereal. I personally think that both work, and can work. I think that they're different and that we shouldn't, like mix and I think that's a real good recommendation, is not to mix and match material from one and the other, especially like the presentations of what the signs of the zodiac means are going to be somewhat different depending on whether you're doing tropical or sidereal. I personally work with tropical astrology. Those are the traditions that I'm most interested in and feel most connected to are all like tropical traditions. So I'm going to present this series from the tropical perspective, but just know that I think sidereal is perfectly valid if that's what you're interested in and that's what you want to do. Also, we have the issues of ancient and traditional astrology versus modern astrology. Again, we have no official position on this. My own personal, the astrologers I've been studying with and the traditions that I've been practicing in are really rooted in the traditions, from like Hellenistic, medieval, Renaissance practices, but then also incorporating aspects of modern astrology as well, like, the planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and some other ideas drawn from modern astrology, like the psychological perspective. Traditional astrology often is much more focused on external life events, will I be successful? How much, will I be able to make money? Will I be successful in my career? Whereas modern astrology tends to focus on psychological issues, like what is my personality like? And I think, again, both of these can really work. And it's just two different perspectives that we can take that are actually very complementary and, of course, interdependent. The way that your personality is set up and the things that happen to you are totally dependent on each other, right? The way that you are will influence the types of things that happen to you, and the types of things that happen to you, will influence your personality. So again, I think that's a place where we can really draw on both the modern and traditional teachings. We'll talk more about what house, if you're not familiar with what house systems in astrology are, we'll talk more about that. Again, I think there's a lot of different house systems out there, and I think they can all be valid. I personally, I personally use both whole sign and quadrant systems at the same time. For the purposes of this class, I'm going to be teaching whole sign. I think it's the easiest place to start. I think it really simplifies things, and as we'll see, some of the logic behind the meanings of the houses kind of relies on the whole sign logic. So I'll be presenting whole sign, but again, we encourage people to take a look at these things and to experiment and try things out, and we're not taking any official position about what's right and wrong. Now with the planets, we also have the 7 classical planets, which are the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. We'll also be talking a little bit about the lunar nodes. That's the head of the Caput Draconis, the head of the dragon, and Cauda Draconis, the tail of the dragon, also known as the North Node and the South Node. We'll be talking about those a little bit in this series, but we're really focusing on the 7 classical planets. There's also the outer planets, like Uranus, Neptune, also Pluto, as well as the asteroids and some other things, like Chiron, the different asteroids and other objects that have been added in modern astrology. I think all of those, can have their place. I personally think that while those things can be meaningful and can be useful, they're really like kind of a secondary thing to the classical planets. So we're really just going to focus on the classical planets in this series. But again, I'm not saying that they're invalid or anything like that. And I definitely use, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in my own personal work. All right, and then traditional sign rulerships. By this, I mean that the 12 signs of the zodiac in traditional sign rulerships are just ruled by the classical planets. So in particular, we say that Aquarius, is ruled by Saturn rather than by Uranus. Pisces is ruled by Jupiter rather than by Neptune. Now, this is, I think, important not just for the logic and sort of symmetry and harmony of the zodiac, but also for astrological magic. When you're doing invocations of the signs of the zodiac, if you think that Aquarius is ruled exclusively by Uranus, there's no way that you could use a hexagram ritual to invoke that power. So at least for the purposes of the magical practices that we're going to teach teach here, it's really important to use traditional sign rulerships. Again, for your own astrological practice, you're welcome to experiment with those things, but I'm definitely going to present this stuff from a perspective of traditional sign rulerships. All right, and then just because I was a little afraid that the first few classes in this series could seem a little disconnected, I just wanted to give you a brief outline of the whole 7-part series. I reserve the right to change this, if we need to rearrange things or anything like that, but just a brief outline. So today, in our first class here, we'll be talking about the symbolism of the hexagram, the divine word ararita, something called the analysis of the keyword, and then we'll put those things together to practice the lesser ritual of the hexagram. Then in 2 weeks, we'll sort of shift gears and we'll look at the nature and meanings of the 7 classical planets. We'll look at some of the Orphic hymns to use as invocations of the planetary powers. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the kind of philosophical and conceptual and cosmological issues surrounding the practice and sort of theory of astrology. Then in our third class, a month from now, we'll learn the greater ritual of the hexagram for the invocation of planetary powers. We'll look at planetary correspondences, divine and angelic hierarchies of the planets, as well as a timing system called the planetary days and hours that you can use for ritual timing. In our fourth class, we'll do an introduction to horoscopic astrology. So we'll review some of the basics components of reading an astrological chart, an astrological horoscope. Then in the fifth class, we'll sort of dive into the meanings of the 12 signs of the zodiac, and we'll also look at how to use the greater ritual of the hexagram to invoke zodiacal powers, and we'll look at the zodiacal correspondences and the divine and angelic hierarchies for the signs of the zodiac. Then in our second to last class, the sixth class, we'll sort of do some more stuff about horoscopic astrology, also some things on the cycles and the use of the presence of cycles and the importance of cycles in astrology, and some of the cosmological and magical and philosophical significance of that focus on cycles, as well as the uses of astrology for calendrical purposes. And we'll even talk about the Thelemic dating system that relies on astrology. And then our last class, this one's a little bit open. I may add or subtract things here, but we'll look at the way that Crowley does some very creative and interesting things with hexagrams and hexagram rituals in the Book of Lies. We'll look at the symbolism of the heptagram, the 7-sided, 7-pointed stars, especially as they are relevant to Babylon and to the beast. We'll look at Liber Ararita, and possibly a few other things as well. So the seventh one will be really kind of diving into some of this symbolism of hexagrams and planets in specifically the Thelemic tradition. Though of course we'll touch on that all the way along. All right, so some of you have seen this diagram before. I used it in the workshop that we just did in December on the pentagram and on elemental magic. So we have this distinction with the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm, the small world and the big world, the individual. Now the microcosm can be understood either as the individual person, and then the macrocosm as the entire everything that exists, the entire cosmos, or we can understand the microcosm as kind of geocentric cosmology, as the elemental world, and then the macrocosm as the sphere of the moon and beyond. So when we're talking about the microcosmic powers are symbolized by the pentagram and by the elements, and the macrocosmic powers by the planets. And so here we see the sphere of the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the signs of the zodiac, and then the heavenly regions beyond that. And the idea is as above, so below, that the microcosm is the reflection of the macrocosm, and the macrocosm is the reflection of the microcosm, that these things are fractal and interdependent and are reflections on each other. And the macrocosm, as we'll see, is going to be represented, where the microcosm is represented by the pentagram, the macrocosm is going to be represented by the hexagram. And one way of talking about the great work and the accomplishment of the great work is the unification of the microcosm and the macrocosm, which we symbolize as 5, for the pentagram, plus 6 for the hexagram equals 11, the number of the great work. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the symbolism of the hexagram. So first, just a quick sort of survey of some historical usages of the hexagram. The hexagram is a really universal symbol, and I'm sure is invented independently by a number of different cultures, and is used for a variety of spiritual and magical purposes in a number of different traditions. So in Indian traditions, we see, this is just two examples. One example, the Anahata chakra, which is the energy center, associated with the heart, in the heart center. It's often depicted in an image, that includes the hexagram that you see there on the left in the yogic traditions. Interestingly, we'll see that the hexagram is especially associated with the sun and with solar powers. And the Anahata chakra at the heart center, we also associate the heart chakra with the sun, which is very interesting. It also shows up in mandalas. This is actually a Tibetan mandala, but of course, the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition, comes out of India. And this is the mandala of Vajrayogini. All right. We also have the hexagram is used a lot in the Islamic and Arabic and Persian magical traditions. It's often referred to as the Seal of Solomon. Now, sometimes they also use the pentagram and call it the Seal of Solomon, and sometimes other figures as well, but the hexagram is very commonly called the Seal of Solomon. And in the medieval Islamic tradition, there's a lot of lore, magical teachings and lore and legends and stories that arise about King Solomon. One of these being that he enlisted an army of demons, to build his palace, and so he really takes on the he becomes in some ways like kind of the archetypal wizard or magician. And so the hexagram, associated his seal, gains the significance of being able to protect against spirits, to protect against demons, or to command them and have power over them. And it's also used as a symbol of power and of protection. So there's a really amazing Islamic tradition of like talismanic objects. And on the left there, you see a talismanic shirt. This was, I believe was owned by one of the, actually, I'm forgetting off the top of my head now. But the various sultans, the Ottomans especially, seem to be interested in these talismanic shirts, and there's hundreds of them still survive. And you can see that the two hexagrams on the shirt there. The shirt would have been worn like under a suit of armor in battle, to protect the wearer. And it's hard to see in this image now, but this whole like lower part of the shirt, these are all grids, based on magic squares that are full of letters, arranged in these grid-like patterns. And you also have like phrases and sentences from the Quran written there. And even inside of the hexagram, these are all like grids of Arabic letters. So the whole shirt, it has a talismanic quality. And then we also have, this is called a kawari. This is from Indonesia. And so it's just this small, like a couple centimeters in diameter, kind of coin sort of shape. You would have worn two of them, one like hanging down into the chest, one hanging down into the back. And on one side of them, at least in this version anyways, there was a hexagram, and written around it, you have this says Allah, and this says Muhammad, and that just alternates in the circles. So the use of divine names, in connection with the hexagram. And then on the other side of this little talisman, you have a kind of version of a magic square. And so that was used for protection. All right, the hexagram also shows up in the Jewish, both folk traditions. And now I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the hexagram as like the symbol of Judaism. That's really a pretty recent thing that doesn't really there's an interesting history about it. And Gershom Scholem has some interesting writings about how the hexagram came to be like the symbol of Judaism, but that's really quite recent and doesn't really happen until the 19th century, though it does show up in a lot of Jewish magical writings and in other places as well. So on the right there, that's from the Sefer Ratziel, which is an important Kabbalistic text. And again, we see the hexagram along with some divine names inside of it, like Shaddai and the Tetragrammaton. Yeah. All right, and then coming, I think, primarily, out of the Islamic tradition and passing into, the later medieval and Renaissance Europe, we also have the hexagram in the grimoire tradition, and especially in the Solomonic tradition, again, because this is the association with King Solomon and his ability to command demons and spirits. So the top there, we have hexagram figure from the Lemegeton, which is also known as the Lesser Key of Solomon or the Goetia. And we read in that text, associated with this image here, this is the form of the hexagram of Solomon, the figure whereof is to be made on parchment of a calf's skin, and worn at the skirt of thy white vestment, and covered with a cloth of fine linen, white and pure, the which is to be shown unto the spirits when they do appear, so that they be compelled to take human shape upon them and be obedient. So again, this idea of them being able to command spirits through the use of this sign. And then just a few other examples there. There's a pentacle from the Heptameron. You can also see its relationship to the hexagram from the Lemegeton there. And then also just two examples of talismans from the Key of Solomon that use the image of the hexagram along with some biblical verses and these sort of grids and arrangements of letters and divine names. All right, so that was just a sort of brief look at some of the historical and other traditions and their use of the hexagram. And we'll see some of the same sort of themes and ideas as we go along. But now we can start talking about the way that we in particular use the hexagram and our understanding of these things. So first thing when looking at the hexagram, I thought we could look at some of the Kabbalistic, some very basic Kabbalistic symbolism of the hexagram. There's of course a lot more that you can do with this. This is just a couple of very basic things. So the hexagram, of course, is a six-sided figure. So one of the first places we're going to look into is in the significance of the number 6. So 6 is the value of the Hebrew letter Vav, and that's a Vav that you can see there. And among other important symbolism, one of the things that is really significant about the letter Vav is that it is the sun in the Tetragrammaton. So the Tetragrammaton is Yod, He, Vav, He. We can see that I've written it here on the Tree of Life. That's the Yod, He, Vav, He. And they're associated with the Yod as the father, He is the mother, Vav is the son, the child of the mother and father, and then the final He is the daughter, the second child of the mother and father. And so we can see that when they're placed on the Tree of Life like this, the Vav is specially placed in Tefereth, right at the center of the Tree of Life, but also encompasses this whole middle region of the tree. And we'll talk more about this in coming weeks, about the placement of the hexagram on the Tree of Life and the importance of that. But I just wanted to show you this for now. Now 6 is also the number of Tefereth because it's the 6th Sephirah, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So this is Tefereth here, the 6th Sephirah. Tefereth, is translated as either beauty or as harmony. And we definitely see that images of balance and harmony when we're talking about the hexagram. Tefereth in our tradition is also the sphere of the sun. And we'll see in this class today that the hexagram has although we're going to see it represents all the planetary powers, has a special relationship to the sun and to the solar powers. And again, it's at the center of the Tree of Life. I think that's an important part of the symbolism. And I was also thinking about how the letter Vav, the name of the letter, Vav, spelled in full is spelled as Vav, Vav. And since Vav has a value of 6, Vav, Vav has a value of 12, which is the number of signs of the zodiac. So I thought that was interesting as well, that you can connect Vav, not just to the hexagram and to the symbol of the planets, but also to the 12 signs of the zodiac as well. Which, as we'll see, are very dependent on each other. The signs of the zodiac are really, especially in traditional astrology, are really understood as like the houses or the domiciles, the places where the planets live and the places governed by the 7 planets. All right, another important symbol of the hexagram here is now, just for geometrical reasons, you can't draw a regular 6-sided star. We'll see that there is. We'll talk about something called the unicursal hexagram in some of the coming weeks. So yeah, don't worry about that if you're not familiar with it. But the normal way of drawing a hexagram is actually of 2 separate overlapping or interlaced equilateral triangles. And so we can understand, the hexagram as the union of an upward pointing triangle and a downward pointing triangle. So the upward pointing triangle, is the symbol of the element of fire, and the downward pointing triangle is the symbol of the element of water. So one way you can look at the hexagram is as the union of fire and water. You can also include, air and earth here as well. Like you could take the, if you think of like the upward triangle as air, then you could take this as like the crossbar, across the glyph of air, and then same the other way around. But mostly we're talking about the fire and water triangles united here. And so all these, there's a lot of different polarities and symbols of these kind of primal polarities in the Kabbalistic tradition, and they can all not exactly be interchanged, but each one could come to stand for like a primal polarity. So we can really expand from just fire and water to any sets of polarities, like light and dark, oftentimes male and female, as archetypes. And any other set of polarities, night and day, light and dark, sun and moon, any of these different set of opposites. And if any of you heard, I did a class last month on equilibrium, and we talked a lot about the ideas of the unification of opposites and the sort of the coincidence of opposites and the overcoming of these different like dualities. And so we can really, I think, bring in, if you heard that class, you can really bring in a lot of the things we talked about there with this symbol of the hexagram. So again, it's a symbol of balance and of the unification and harmony of these different opposites and polarities. All right, so interestingly, where we said that the pentagram, represents the microcosm and the hexagram represents the macrocosm, we can also see that polarity of microcosm and macrocosm can actually be kind of folded into the hexagram itself. So this is an image from Eliphas Levi, and so you can see that this is an image of like God brooding over the primal waters, and he's reflected in them. And you can see that his stole there in its reflection, as well as his arms, reflects to make the hexagram here. So you have the idea of the upper, the heavenly or the celestial, reflected in the lower creative world. And so we see in this image, we have in Latin here, quod superius, sicut quod inferius, which means that which is above is like that which is below. And we also see macroprosopis and microprosopis. I talked about that idea in the series that I did on the Sephiroth. I talked about, actually, this slide is from that series as well. So if you want to learn any more about that, I recommend you go and check out that class series on YouTube. But again, it's just this idea of the upper, the celestial, the heavenly, the divine, reflected in the created world, and the hexagram as a symbol of that. Let's see, we got a comment here. Constanter says, active and passive too. Just noticed fire is active, water is passive. Your elemental class came in handy there. Yeah, active and passive is another really good way of talking about that. And I really like to think of like active, passive can be kind of like taken in a negative sort of way. And so I really like to understand passive as receptive. So the active is like, putting things out, and then the receptive is like taking things in. It's really like two sides, it's like systole and diastole, breathing in, exhaling and inhaling. These sort of two poles of motion. Where it's, there's no like privileging of one over the other. But yeah, we definitely talked a lot about that in that elemental series that I did. So again, if you'd like to hear more about that, that's also up on YouTube. Yeah, definitely. And that's, well, I'll leave you to sort of meditate on that. But it's interesting to think about, although, the hexagram and the macrocosmic powers are, in some sense beyond the microcosmic powers, with some of this elemental symbolism, and we'll see some more of this as we go along today. There is an interesting relationship between the two, as if, by unifying the microcosmic powers, and by unifying like the opposites in ourselves or in the microcosmic world, there's a sense of gaining access to the macrocosm through doing that, of like finding spirit within the world of duality. I think a lot of that symbolism can be brought into our understanding of the hexagram. So that's something you could meditate on, about how the higher powers emerge out of the lower powers, in the journey back up the tree of life, where the the higher creates the lower in the creative story, and then we find the higher within the lower in the stories of our own like personal awakening and our own personal spiritual journeys. All right, so we've now really associated the hexagram, with the number 6 and some of the symbolism of the number 6. But we're also going to talk about how the hexagram also becomes associated with the number 7. There's some interesting progressions of numbers in some of the elemental symbolism. You can really link the numbers 3, 4, and 5 together. So where 3 is like the 3 mother letters, Aleph, Mem, and Shin, which represent air, water, and fire. And then from the mixture of air, water, and fire, we produce the 4th element of earth as their consolidation and unification. And then under the 4 elements of fire, water, air, and earth, those things are balanced and unified. And we find the 5th element of spirit within that. So you have this progression of 3, 4, 5. With the hexagram, we also have the 6 and the 7. So again, this relates to some of the stuff we talked about in the class series I did on the Sephiroth about the symbol, like arithmology and the symbolism of counting, from 1 to 10. A lot of this stuff participates in some of that. So in a way, you could see a lot of this stuff as like the next logical step beyond the 5. We now have the 6 and the 7. All right, so from Robert McCoy's Dictionary of Freemasonry, he talks about some of this, about the 6 and the 7 in a way that I think is really useful for us in understanding this stuff. One thing here, he's going to talk about what the Egyptians sort of believed and symbols that they used. I think this is not historically accurate. This is Masonic symbolism. They're just kind of attributing it to the Egyptians, but it's not actually what the Egyptian symbolism is. So just be aware of that. All right, so he says here, the kind, good, gracious, and merciful God, they, meaning the Egyptian priests, delineated by the water triangle, the downward pointing triangle, and the just and angry God by the fire triangle. The triangle, considered as a geometrical figure, is composed of 3 things, which united form one whole, viz. Of 3 particular points and angles, by the union of which the triangle itself is formed as one whole or complete figure. It is for this reason that it has been adopted as a symbol of the triune God. And of course, when he's talking about the triune God here, he's likely thinking about the Christian Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But the Christians certainly are not the originators of the idea of picturing the one as a Trinity and of picturing the divine as a Trinity. That is absolutely an idea that the Christians pick up, from the Greco-Roman tradition and from other places as well. Picturing the divine one in the form of a Trinity is a very, I think, universal sort of archetype. So we can really understand that the triune God in a way that really has nothing to do with Christianity. Or we can just see Christianity as one example among others, but not as the origin of that. Let's see, where were we? So if we unite a water triangle with a fire triangle, we have a 6-pointed star as a symbol of the perfect Godhead in all his attributes and works. So again, this idea of the polarity here, I mean, he's talking about the fire triangle as like the just and angry God, and the water triangle as the gracious and merciful God, which, again, is very like Judeo-Christian sort of way of thinking about God. But again, we can think about that sort of active and passive, or receptive, or, like the 2 pillars in the tree of life of mercy and severity, and the unification of those extremes and that polarity in the hexagram. Okay, and then last here, if we surround this figure with a circle, there will be 7 points in it if we include the center point of the circle, which represents the sacred number 7. So you can see that by surrounding the figure with a circle, that implies the center of the circle. And then that center, if we count that as we can count that center as like a 7th point within the circle. So the 7 emerges out of the 6 in a way that I think is sort of interestingly analogous to the way that the 5 emerges out of the 4. Just like where the 4 can be symbolized by a cross, and then the center of the cross, the place where the 2 bars of the cross meet, can be considered as a 5th thing. Here, the center of the hexagram emerges as a 7th thing. So now that we can connect the hexagram to the 7, we can connect the hexagram to the 7 classical planets. So this is Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun or Sol, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon or Luna. And we're going to talk a lot more in 2 weeks. We'll return to this diagram here and talk about why the planets are placed in the places they are, and some of the symbolism and significance of this fact. But for now, I just want you to see that the hexagram can represent, it can be interpreted as a figure of the 7 planets, and we're really going to use it as a figure that can work with and invoke the powers of these 7 planets, as well as the 12 zodiacal signs that the 7 planets rule. And the other thing I want you to notice here is that the sun is at the center. Just like the sun, the sphere of the sun was at the center of the tree of life. The sun is at the center of the hexagram. And so again, the hexagram, although it's connected to all 7 planets, has a special relationship to the sun. And of course, we can also think about this as a kind of cosmological diagram and a heliocentric cosmological diagram with the sun at the center and then the planets orbiting around the sun. Obviously, the moon actually orbits around the Earth, but the idea that the sun is the center and the other powers being the children of the sun or dependent upon the sun is really seen here in the hexagram. And there's some other ways that this really represents like the balance of the celestial powers, but we'll get into that more in 2 weeks. All right, so from a figure of 7, now we're going to talk about a divine name of 7 letters. So this here is the divine name Ararita. Now, Ararita is formed as an abbreviation or what in Kabbalah is called the Natarikon of a longer phrase, which I've got 2 different like translations of the phrase here. Crowley and others in the Golden Dawn and Thelemic traditions tend to interpret this as one is his beginning, one is his individuality, his permutation is one. And then I also have a more scholarly translation of the phrase here from Mark Verman. And he says, 1, the start of his unification, the start of his unity, his permutation is one, individual and unique. So, somewhat different, but we can really see that it's basically expressing the same idea of the oneness of divinity. Again, people are defaulting here to masculine pronouns. And the Jewish Kabbalists, who formulated this, did the same, of course, talking about God with masculine pronouns. But of course, we understand the divine as something that is, either beyond gender or contains, all possible genders. There's nothing particularly masculine about this, but it really expressing the oneness and unity of the divine and ultimately of all things, but in a name of 7 letters. So again, we have that idea of the unification of the unity and multiplicity with the sacred 7 and the celestial powers. Also the idea that those things are all united or are expressions of a singular one, whole, total divinity. And the fact that Ararita has the 7 letters, we'll link it especially to the planetary and celestial powers, and so we'll be using it both in the lesser and greater ritual, the hexagrams, as a divine name to control and to invoke the macrocosmic as well as the celestial, the planetary and zodiacal powers. Now I'm going to teach this here of just using just the name Ararita as the divine name itself to be used in ritual work. You can also, you can take a look at, David Shoemaker talks about this in Living Thelema, and you can find it in other places as well. You can actually vibrate the full and complete phrase that Ararita is the Natarikon of, and within the second order of the Temple of the Silver Star, we teach a traditional method for the intonation of that full and complete phrase. But it's also perfectly fine to just use just the word Ararita as a divine name in its own right. So that's how I'm going to present it here. But if you're interested in learning more, I recommend you check out the chapter on hexagram rituals in David Shoemaker's Living Thelema. Again, I think both can work just fine. Yeah, but we'll just use Ararita for our purposes. All right, and then I just wanted to include a quote here about some of the significance and Crowley's understanding of the significance of Ararita. The name Ararita shows up a few times, and this is one of Crowley's own notes on Liber 418, which is the vision and the voice. The word Ararita shows up a handful of times in the vision of the voice, and there's some interesting interpretations and even some permutations of the letters that make up Ararita that you can take a look at in the vision of the voice. But in a footnote about one of those places that it shows up, Crowley says, "The use of this name and formula is to equate and identify every idea with its opposite, thus being released from the obsession of thinking any of them as true and therefore binding. One can withdraw oneself from the whole sphere of the Ruach." Now, the Ruach, if you're not familiar with that concept, is one of the Kabbalistic parts of the soul. It represents, both the conventional, rational, conscious mind, as well as really what we think of the ego, the sense of an individual personality, an individual, kind of human self that is placed between the lower sort of animal or physical powers, and then the higher, the higher parts of the immortal part of the soul. So Crowley's talking about being able to transcend that to arrive at the higher, divine powers. So again, we see this idea of equating and identifying every idea with its opposite, just like we talked about in the symbolism of the hexagram, and also of being able, through that unification of opposites and the identification of opposites, there's also a sense of transcendence and of going beyond, the dualistic, the normal dualistic world that we all live in, which is, not evil or bad or anything like that, but that being within the world of duality, kind of blinds us to the unity that lies, well, behind or above or however, whichever direction you like to think of it, this world, right? So that this is a kind of formula for being able to access that unity that lies behind the apparent diversity. Okay, yeah, I think that's a good intro to that. We'll come back to this name throughout the series, and I think especially in the last class in the series, we'll talk about some other interesting things that Crowley does with this name. And there's also a Thelemic holy book called Liber Ararita that we'll take a look at that really develops a lot of these themes and develops this divine name and the symbolism of the letters, and we'll take a look at that later on. But this should give you a basic sense of the significance of it and why we're using it in the way that we do. Oh, right. And then we also have, this is a quote from Liber 65, the Book of the Heart, Girt with the Serpent, another one of the Thelemic holy books. And in chapter 5 there, we read, "Also, he taught me the holy, unutterable word Ararita, so that I melted the sixfold gold into a single invisible point, whereof naught may be spoken." And so again, this idea of unity being found within diversity. We have gold here, which is the metal associated with the sun. And this idea that Ararita is a power or that Ararita, has this power of being able to produce the unity out of being able to return to the unity out of the created diversity or duality. And again, with the symbolism of gold and the sun, we find that link of the hexagram to the solar powers. All right, now we need to talk about something called the analysis of the keyword. And we're going to look at a particularly Thelemic version of the analysis of the keyword. This version is presented in Living Thelema by David Shoemaker. This is another thing that we have within our initiatory order. We teach a special version of this to initiates, but this is a perfectly serviceable form of it that we can all use. Now, the analysis of the keyword derives originally from some Golden Dawn rituals that we're not going to get into here, both because they get a little too close to things that I can't talk about publicly, and because it's not really extremely relevant to our purposes here. The main thing to know is that this emerges out of a ritual that's associated with Tefereth. So again, that connection to Tefereth, to the center of the tree of life, and to the sun as well. All right, so I'll just read through the whole thing here of the analysis of the keyword, and then we'll break it down into pieces. All right, so the analysis of the keyword. And again, this is a Thelemic version of this, so it's a little bit different than the version presented in like Golden Dawn sources or even in Crowley's Liber O. All right, so I-N-R-I, Yod, Nun, Resh, Yod, Virgo, Isis, Holy Mother, Scorpio, Apophis, Destroyer, Sol, Osiris, Holy Father, Isis, Apophis, Osiris, Iao, the sign of Osiris, the sign of the dance of Isis, the sign of the ecstasy of Apophis, the sign of the shining star, LVX, looks, the light of the true cross. All right, so let's break this down into pieces. First, we have INRI. Now, historically speaking, so INRI is most simply and directly the initials of the phrase Iesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum, which in Latin translates to Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And so in the Gospel of John, we read, Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. So the idea here is that, that full phrase, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, was written in 3 languages and placed on a sign above the cross. But in the artistic and traditions, at least in like Western European tradition, this phrase is often abbreviated to just its Latin initials of INRI, and you can see that above the cross, INRI in the image there on the left. And then what happens is that in the like alchemical and then the Rosicrucian and Masonic traditions, these initials INRI start to become interpreted as having an esoteric significance. So again, from McCoy's Dictionary of Freemasonry, McCoy says, in the Philosophical Lodge, they referring to the letters INRI, represent fire, salt, sulfur, and mercury. I'll leave you to reflect on how those 4 letters might represent fire, salt, sulfur, and mercury. I can think of at least one way that could be true, but I'll leave you to reflect on that if you're interested. Let's see. In the system of the Rosicrucians, they had a similar use: Igne, Natura, Renovatar, Integra. And so we can see again, this is a Latin phrase whose initials are INRI, but now it's like a reinterpretation of those initials as standing for a different Latin phrase. And so McCoy translates this phrase as, by fire, nature is perfectly renewed. You'll also see, he's interpreting or translating integra there as perfectly. You'll also see it as like wholly or completely. So like, by fire, nature is completely renewed, or nature is wholly renewed by fire. So obviously participating in some of the Christian, symbolism of like death and resurrection, but understood it as a truth about nature, right? That destruction is part of the cycles of the natural world, and even produces perfection. And especially if we think about alchemy, the first matter in alchemy is destroyed and dissolved and putrefied. There's a lot of sense of destroying that first matter and breaking it apart, of burning it, of separating it in order to produce the pure essence out of it. So we can even interpret this alchemically, that the fire destroys, but also perfects, sort of uplifts by destroying the lower elements, and then produces the essence out of it. So again, if we want to go back to like elemental symbolism, we can think about the mixed elements are burnt up, and that through that process we find the essence, or the spirit that lies within them. So this is a way that we can access a meaning of these initials that doesn't rely on Christian symbolism and doesn't rely on the idea of like death as a singular transformative catastrophe. The Thelemic, I think, idea of death and resurrection is that that change itself is both death and resurrection. That at every moment moment, you are a slightly different person than you were in the moment before. So in some sense, you have died. That person that you were just a moment ago is now dead, and now a new person has come into being. And so that death and resurrection, rather than being like a singular kind of crisis or event, is actually just the laws of nature herself. All right, that's enough about him. That's something you won't see too often, images of crucifixion in our class series here, but it is relevant to the origins of these things. All right, so going back to the keyword now, the first section there, we have INRI, and then Yod, Nun, Resh, Yod. So I've constructed a table here, and so you can see that the letter I, the closest to the Hebrew, if you transliterate the letter I into Hebrew, you get Yod. If you transliterate N into Hebrew, you get the letter Nun. Transliterate the letter R into Hebrew, you get the letter Resh. And then Yod, I again will be another Yod. Now, if we think of our what are called the Astrologic correspondences, the correspondences of the Hebrew letters to the elements, planets, and signs of the zodiac, Yod corresponds with Virgo, Nun corresponds with Scorpio, and with Scorpio here too, we also want to think of like the death card in the tarot. That is definitely relevant to this symbolism here. And with Resh, that corresponds to the sun, which, the sun in Latin is soul. So we see that in the keyword here, but soul just means sun in Latin. And then again, Yod corresponding with Virgo. Now taking the next step beyond this, we're going to drop the last letter there and just focus, because it's a repetition, of the first letter, and just focus on the three unique symbols that we find here of Virgo, Scorpio, and the sun. So now we have like a line-by-line interpretation of each one. So we have Virgo, Isis, Holy Mother. So Virgo here is being interpreted as the goddess Isis. That wouldn't be like a standard attribution to Virgo, but Virgo is the virgin or the maiden, and so that's being understood, for the purposes of this formula. Excuse me. For the purposes of this formula, is understood as representing the goddess Isis. Now Scorpio. Again, because of the associations with death and destruction, Scorpio is the night house of Mars. And Scorpio is also linked to serpents. One of the cherubic animals associated with Scorpio is the serpent. And so this is linked to the Egyptian being, not exactly a deity, more of a monster, really, Apophis or Apep. And we'll talk about him, all these figures more in a moment. And then the sun here is being interpreted, so that's Scorpio, Apophis, destroyer, and then Sol, Osiris, Holy Father. In the original version of the Golden Dawn version of the analysis of the keyword, it was Sol, Osiris, slain and risen. So really emphasizing that death and resurrection and very kind of Christian symbolism here. But here it's been reinterpreted so that Isis and Osiris are mother and father, and then Apophis is the child as well as the destroyer. And again, we'll develop this more in a moment. And then the initials, Isis, Apophis, Osiris, the initials of those things are I-A-O, which then interpreted as the Greek letters and the spelling of the divine name Iao. And the divine name Iao, well, there's so much that we could talk about that name. But one thing here to know is that it is, so one of the divine name of Tefereth can be abbreviated as Yod, Aleph, Vav. That's Yod He Vav He Vadath. Right. So sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Right. So we can abbreviate the divine name of Tefereth to Hebrew letters that are equivalent to IAO or to Iao. So again, linking this name to Tefereth and to the solar powers. All right. And then I'll go through some of this here, but there's also in the Thelemic holy books and in some of Crowley's writing, there's some deeper and very like multi-layered interpretations of the divine name Yao and of these figures of Isis, Apophis, and Osiris. So in Liber 66, this is Liber Stellii Rubii, the book of the Ruby Star. We read, I, Apep the serpent, am the heart of Iao. Isis shall await Asar, and I in the midst. Right, so Asar is another name for Osiris. And so we now actually have the speaker, at least in part of this book, is Apep or Apophis the serpent. And here's being presented as the heart of Iao. Yeah, and we'll develop that a little bit more in a few moments, but that's something to pay attention to when you're studying the Thelemic holy books, especially the way that Apep or Apophis is reinterpreted as, not something like bad or negative or frightening, but as a deep mystery. All right, so let's take a brief look at at these figures here. So this is Isis, who's also sometimes known as a sea. You'll see that in some of the Thelemic holy books. So we got an image of there on the left there from the coffin of Tutankhamun. And sometimes she's portrayed as winged. It's a little bit difficult to see in this image, but she typically has the throne glyph above her head. And I just realized that the throne glyph looks a little bit like the letter L, and that will be significantly related to Isis in a few minutes. But that's the normal way of identifying Isis, is she has that glyph of a throne above her head. Now in the mythology, I'm not going to get into all of it. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with like the basic sort of story of Isis and Osiris. Isis and Osiris are a divine couple. They're husband and wife, as well as brother and sister. And so there you can see them together in some cities and at certain times. And so they together give birth to the child Horus. Isis gives birth to the child Horus. And so at least in some cities and at certain times, Isis, Osiris, and Horus are actually worshipped as a specific like divine trinity. And we can connect that, of course, to our ideas of like mother, father, and child. You can even connect that to like the tetragrammaton, father, mother. And the tetragrammaton, of course, has two children of son and daughter. This is just like one child. But again, the idea of trinities and of like mother and father as the opposites that unite to produce the child. All of that symbolism can be brought in here. All right, and then next we have an association between a few different figures. So in the center there, we have Apophis or Apep, who is a kind of serpent figure from Egyptian mythology, who menaces the solar bark, the boat that the sun travels on. Every night as the bark travels through the underworld, it is menaced by this serpent and has to be overcome. So again, some of this images of destruction and of darkness associated with Apophis. Now, in the myth of Isis and Osiris, Osiris is murdered by his brother, Set, or in modern Egyptology, his name is usually given as Seth, but in our tradition, we usually call him Set, and that's Set there on the right. Set's a very interesting deity. His interpretation really changes throughout Egyptian history. Early on, he's not like such a bad or evil figure. He is often associated with the deserts and with the wastes, the infertile places in the desert, that dry and hot, where there's no water and the crops don't grow. He's often sometimes associated with foreign things, and the Egyptians are really not too keen on foreigners for the most part. So he does have these kind of frightening or dangerous associations, but then as the tradition goes on, he becomes more and more of like an evil, negative figure. But early on, he is not. And so we can see here, this is a sculpture of a statue of Set, and and this is a detail from a statue of Set and Horus crowning Ramses III. Interestingly, Set, Oh yeah, yeah. You can relate Set to Loki. Sure. I'm really not that great on Northern mythology, so I don't know that much about the mythology of Loki. But yeah, that's certainly a good connection to make. Interesting thing about Set is that the animal whose head Set has, no one knows what this animal is, whether it was an animal invented by the Egyptians, an animal that's now extinct, a composite of several different animals. His snout looks something like an anteater, but anteaters don't have ears like this. Some people have thought that it might be some form of a jackal, but the ears are always portrayed as square. And when the total animal is drawn, like in the hieroglyph of Set, the animal even has a forked tail. So this is still a big mystery of what animal that animal is. And in the literature, the animal is just referred to as the Set animal. But anyways, so Set is the enemy of Osiris, and then later also the enemy of Horus. And in this mythology, Set, well, there's a kind of variety of episodes in the story, but Set murders Osiris and cuts his body into 14 pieces and scatters them. And then Isis goes out and finds the pieces, puts them back together, though Osiris's phallus is not found, at least in some versions anyways. It was eaten by a fish, and she has to use a stone phallus. Yeah, there's other deities, involved in that story as well. I'm really just simplifying here to get some of the basic symbolism that's relevant to what we're talking about here today. Right, so Set is the destroyer of Osiris. And then in the sort of Greco-Roman and Hellenistic tradition, both Apophis and Set are associated with the Greek monster Typhon, who is a sort of serpentine monster, giant who challenges Zeus and is cast down and thrown into the underworld. And there you can see an image of. Oh no problem at all. That sort of is all really interesting, great stuff to look into. We just don't have time for it here. That's all. And so yeah, right. So Typhon is a serpentine monster. You can see here. This is a detail from one of Athanasius Kirker's books, Oedipus Aegyptiacus, which is a really important book in the history of Western esotericism. Our version of the Tree of Life comes from this book, and yeah, you can see this is his version of Typhon, this sort of serpentine monster. Is he a wind too? I'm not sure. I don't really know that much about the mythology of Typhon, to be perfectly honest. I haven't really looked that closely into it. Oh, right. Okay. But then anyway, so then last thing before we move on from this slide, I just wanted to give you another quote from one of the Thelemic holy books that starts to really reinterpret the figure of Apophis as something divine and sacred and even sort of beyond Isis and Osiris in a way. So again, in Liber 65, we read, "Arise, O serpent Apep, thou art Adonai the beloved one. Thou art my darling and my lord, and thy poison is sweeter than the kisses of Isis, the mother of the gods." So now we have the serpent Apep being directly associated with Adonai, and Adonai is a name used for the holy guardian angel. So we've got this real kind of radical transformation of Apep from the evil destroyer. From the evil destroyer to a really sacred and holy thing. And I think that's something really worth meditating on. You can read through, there's a lot of this imagery of serpents and of poison is really developed in Liber 65. So it's a great thing to take a look at if you're not so familiar with that text. And this idea of this sweet poison, Crowley's own Crowley was very familiar with the artistic traditions in both England and in France of the late 19th century, some of the symbolist and decadent traditions, and they often use the symbolism of poison. Or poison as a way of talking about intoxication, in A Season in Hell by the French poet Rimbaud, he has that line, "I've swallowed a great draught of poison," right? But he's talking about hashish and or wine, right? So they're using poison as a way of talking about intoxication. And so we're not talking here about like literal intoxication, but like divine ecstasy and rapture, which can have a kind of destructive element in a way that it's like breaking up the ruach and the sense of the lower self, the illusion of duality, and revealing something higher beyond that. All right, we really need to keep moving here. So finally, here's Osiris. Again, Osiris in the mythology that's relevant for what we're talking about today is murdered by Set, cut into 14 pieces. He's reassembled by Isis, and then although he's resurrected, he like descends to the underworld and becomes the king of the underworld. Yeah, so that's what's the main parts that are relevant for us today. In the sort of mainline Egyptian tradition, Osiris isn't particularly solar, though he kind of picks up that significance, especially in like the Hellenistic reinterpretation of Egyptian mythology, and continues that in our tradition. And we can think about the solar heroes and solar mythology as having a lot to do with death and resurrection, of like the passing through the underworld in order to rise again in the east. Though again, the Crowley, talks about the idea that now we understand that both, on a daily level as well as a yearly level, the sun isn't actually like lost into the underworld or disappears. And in the winter, the sun isn't actually dying. It's only our perspective that changes. The sun is actually like constant and eternal. It's only us that lose sight of it at times. And so, yeah, some of that death and underworld and resurrection, we can understand that as a way of talking about some of these solar myths and the sort of solar process of descending into the underworld and then being born again in the east. All right, so 2 quotes here from this is from Plutarch's Isis and Osiris, which is. He doesn't do a great job of like representing the actual beliefs and traditions of the Egyptians, but it's a really important book for the Greco-Roman like reception of Egyptian mythology, and is really influential on the entire development of the esoteric tradition. And he, really identifies both Apophis and Set with the Greek figure of Typhon in that work. I just read it recently, this work of Plutarch's. It's interesting, if you want to look into the way that like Egyptian mythology is transformed in the esoteric tradition, though it didn't have any like really extreme the revelations I was hoping it might have. But anyways, here's just one quote from Plutarch here. He says, the Egyptians have a legend that the soul of Osiris is everlasting and imperishable, but that his body, Typhon, oftentimes dismembers and causes to disappear, and that Isis wanders hither and yon in search for it and fits it together again. For that which really is and is perceptible and good is superior to destruction and change. Plutarch actually gives a lot of different interpretations of Isis and Osiris and Typhon. He really talks about Typhon as in this idea of Apophis, or the destroyer, as just like the process of death and destruction, within nature. And at least in some parts, he talks about this as something that isn't evil, but is just like connected to change. So in some ways, Plutarch is actually like closer to our tradition than the intervening like Christian period that separates us from his time. All right, and then again, I was talking about Crowley and the Thelemic holy books developing some alternative. Like deeper layered interpretations of these 3 figures and the mythology associated with him. So here's a quote here from Magic in Theory and Practice. It's actually from a footnote in chapter 5. Crowley had been talking about like the standard interpretation of the divine in Iao and Isis, Apophis, Osiris, associated with like death and resurrection. And then he says there was also quite a different formula in which I is the father, O the mother, A the child. And so here this is very kind of like procreative sexual symbolism, where the I is the phallus by shape, the O is like the vulva or the womb by shape, and then the A, which we could interpret as the pentagram, interestingly, is the child or the product of the mother and father. And then Crowley goes on and says, and yet another in which IAO are all fathers of different kinds, balanced by HHH, three mothers, to complete the universe. This is another way of talking about some of the symbolism of the hexagram. And if we have time, maybe I'll come back to this later in the series, because it's another interesting way of looking at the hexagram. But it's something you can look into as well if you're interested. And he says, in a third, the true formula of the beast 666, I and O are the opposites, which form the field for the operation of A. But this is a higher matter unsuited for an elementary handbook. So again, talking about some of this reinterpretation of these things in the Thelemic context. All right, so continuing on with the analysis, the keyword here, we have a series of signs, and these are signs that you will actually give in the performance of hexagram rituals. So first we have the sign of Osiris, which is standing upright with the arms extended as a cross. And I'll show you a video of myself performing this so you can see these signs a little bit clearer. In the original version, or the Golden Dawn version of this was the sign of Osiris slain, right? And so that gesture is obviously related to the symbol of crucifixion, though we are, reinterpreting that here. Then we have the sign of the dance of Isis, originally called the sign of the mourning of Isis, but instead of thinking of this as a mournful thing about death and about loss, instead the idea of both creation and destruction as part of the constant, like an eternal dance of nature or the dance of life, right, into something joyful. Then the sign of the ecstasy of Apophis. Originally, this was just, or in the Golden Dawn, this was called the sign of Apophis and Typhon. Now the sign of the ecstasy of Apophis. And we're going to talk about that idea of associating like Apophis and the poison of the serpent with spiritual ecstasy. And then finally, what in the Golden Dawn version was called the sign of Osiris risen, right? The sign of resurrection, the crossing the arms on the breast. We're calling the sign of the shining star. And you can think about the arms crossed on the breast forming the pentagram, like the head would be the top point of the pentagram, the hands at the shoulders, the middle 2 points, and then like the elbows being like the lower 2 points. So we also have some of this pentagram symbolism here. But again, I'm just giving you some of the basic symbolism here. This is all really good stuff to meditate on and reflect on. I think there's a lot of really, a lot of deeper stuff that you can get into. Now, these last three signs here, by their shape, are being interpreted as the letters L, V, X. So the sign of the dance of Isis doesn't really look too much like an L, but it does look a lot like the Hebrew letter Lamed, which is equivalent to the letter L. Sign of the ecstasy of Apophis, with the arms lifted above the head, you're literally just like making a big V with your arms. And then with the arms crossed on the breast, your arms are making like an X. So this is then interpreted as the letters L, V, X, which spell the Latin word lux, which means light. And so this is the light of spirit. The divine light is called the lux. And again, there's a lot of deeper mysteries that you can really look into and meditate on here. I forgot to put it in. The letters L, V, X can all be placed onto a cross so that the L would be like, if you think of like an equal armed cross, the L would be like the top and one of the arms of the cross, right? The X is basically a cross just rotated slightly, and then the V would be like the top portion of that cross. So the L, the V, and the X those letters can all be combined together into the symbolism of an equal armed cross. So that's another interesting connection here. And if you're familiar with Liber Resh, in the morning, you're just giving just this sign. That sign of the cross really contains the other three signs in the same way that the symbol of the cross contains the letters L, V, and X, within it. Let's see. Starlight here is pointing out the relation to the letter L to the light, love, liberty, and life, love, liberty, and light. Which, that's a really great connection to make. All right, so then again, just the analysis of the keyword now. I'll just read through it again, and hopefully now you can follow along with how we're taking a set of symbols and then just sort of step-by-step interpreting and transforming and understanding this. So we have I, N, R, I, Yod, Nun, Resh, Yod, Virgo, Isis, Holy Mother. Scorpio, Apophis, Destroyer. Sol, Osiris, slain and Sol, Osiris, Holy Father. Isis, Apophis, Osiris, Iao. Then the sign of Osiris, the sign of the dance of Isis, the sign of the ecstasy of Apophis, the sign of the shining star. LVX, looks, the light of the cross. All right, so just a refresher here. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, and I went into more detail about this in the series that I did on pentagram rituals and the elements. But here's the elements attributed to the 4 quarters. So the circle there would be like your ritual space. So the eastern part of your ritual space is attributed to the element of air. Southern part of the space is attributed to fire. The west attributed to water, and the north attributed to earth. All right, so here I just wanted to, don't worry about this diagram too much. I just want to show you what we're going to do is construct 4 different versions of the hexagram to associate with the elements and with the quarters. Now the origin of this, now these aren't arranged exactly the same way that we're going to use them, and they're not interpreted the same way that we're going to use them. I just wanted to show you this from the, this is a magic circle from the Key of Solomon. And we see in the south here, we actually have a hexagram in the circle. And then we have different arrangements of 2 equilateral triangles in the other quarters. Now, again, these are arranged differently than the way we're going to use them. But this is just the origin of that thing. And I think no one really knows what exactly the creators of this intended by the hexagrams. I've seen people like Nick Farrell talk about the idea that they may represent geomantic figures, though the particular geomantic figures that they would be don't really make a lot of sense. Anyways, but that's just the origin of what you're about to see. All right, so we now have the 4 elemental hexagrams. Now, unlike with the pentagram, like in the lesser ritual of the pentagram, you're going around to the 4 quarters and you're drawing the same pentagram, but vibrating different divine names. Here you're going to be vibrating the same divine name, Ararita, but drawing different hexagrams. And also, unlike the lesser ritual of the pentagram, these are definitely directly associated with the elements. So you're invoking sort of the macrocosmic correlates of the 4 elements in each one of the quarters. So again, this is something I think you can really reflect on about why these particular symbols represent the elements. Obviously fire is made of 2 like active triangles there because fire is the most pure and active there. Earth as like the final product of the active and passive there shows the hexagram fully united. And then I like to think of water and air as kind of like the intermediate sort of stages that include both the active and the passive, but not fully united like they are on the earth. And we can see that in the water hexagram, the passive or water triangle is on top. And in the air hexagram, the active triangle is on top. So that's how I've come to understand them, anyways. Though I think you can reflect further on that. But yeah, so these will be our associations of the 4 elemental hexagrams to these 4 hexagrams to the elements. And so we'll place them in the quarters in their normal attribution. This is a really big like misconception and thing that's been really misleading for a lot of the Golden Dawn traditions is the way that these are attributed to the quarters. If you look at like the Golden Dawn versions of the lesser ritual, the hexagram, as well as like Liber O of Crowley's, you'll see that the elements are like fire is attributed to the east, and then the elements just go in order counterclockwise. So you would have like water in the north, air in the west, and earth in the south. That particular arrangement was only ever used within something called the Vault of the Adepts, which is a special ritual space used within like the Golden Dawn's inner order. So that particular arrangement was only used within that one particular ritual space where the directional correspondences are just different. But outside of that ritual space, the idea was that you rearrange them to correspond to the normal quarter attributions. Did the Thelemistias have a good explanation of this? Yeah, they have some good material. I'm not surprised. Right, so we're assuming that you're not working within a Vault of the Adepti here, so we'll have them attributed to the quarters in their normal, usual fashion, just like in pentagram rituals. All right, so now that we know which hexagrams we're doing, we now need to know how to draw them, because you're going to be drawing them in the air, just like in a pentagram ritual, you'd be drawing the pentagrams in the air. So we have both invoking and banishing forms of each one. And there you can see the diagrams. You see a little 1 and a 2. You're starting, where the little open circle is, and then, going in the direction that the arrow has and tracing them all the way around. And so obviously this is made in 2 separate gestures. You're drawing one triangle and sort of withdrawing your implement and then drawing the second triangle. So you can obviously just memorize these, but I find it easier to remember like rules for how to do this. So the easy rule for remembering how to draw them is, for one thing, whenever you're drawing these triangles, you're always beginning with like the single point, right? So you're always beginning with that single like central point. So for this triangle, you're beginning here. For this triangle, you're beginning here. You're beginning here, 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 right? You're never beginning like you're never starting like off to the left or right. Here, you're starting both triangles, at that point. And so you're always going to draw first the triangle that points upward. This is another error that crept in some versions of Regardi's stuff in the Golden Dawn. The water triangle was printed upside down. So this has been another error that's like crept in. But these are the correct way to do it here. So you're drawing the upward pointing triangle first. And then you just remember with the fire triangle where you have 2 upward pointing triangles, you're just drawing the upper one first and then the lower one. And so the simple rule to distinguish between banishing and invoking is that when you invoke, you're going clockwise, and when you're banishing, you're going counterclockwise. You should draw these fairly large. Now, obviously, like the water and air hexagrams, like sort of take up more space because they're not overlapping. So they're not all going to be exactly the same size. But you can draw them approximately the same size that you would draw the pentagrams. So, somewhere about like around the crown of your head to your lower torso. If you're using a wand or something like that, that'll obviously make your arm, effectively longer. And so you'll draw them a little bit bigger. That's a good rough size. And now all 4 of these are going to be visualized in a golden light. When we get to the greater ritual, the hexagram, will start using different colors for the different powers. But here we're just doing them all in a golden light. So yeah, Devin saying, I thought the pentagrams were used for elements and the hexagrams were used for planets. Are they interchangeable? No, they're not interchangeable. And I think this is something like worth, thinking about and reflecting on. And I think that practice will make it clear. You would never be doing the lesser ritual of the hexagram to invoke a particular element. It's almost like you're using the macrocosmic like correlates of the elements in order to invoke like a balanced, complete macrocosmic power. So it's not exactly elemental. It's hard to explain. And I really think that practice and experience will make it clear that it's sort of elemental. It's like almost like starting with the elements, or we're using some of the elemental symbolism to access something that's beyond or like higher than the elements. That's how I've come to understand it anyways. But yeah, that can be a little bit confusing, certainly. But yeah, you would never be using this to invoke, you're really invoking macrocosmic power, you're not invoking elemental power, and you would never be using this to invoke like a particular element. All right, so we're definitely gonna run a couple minutes over here. If you need to take off, no worries, I'll put this up on YouTube. But yeah, we'll just finish off here with the instructions and how to actually perform the lesser ritual of the hexagram now that we've built up all the component parts we need to put the ritual together. So like I said, the lesser ritual of the hexagram manipulates what we're calling generalized macrocosmic force. In the same way that the lesser ritual of the pentagram manipulates like generalized microcosmic force. And then use like the greater pentagram rituals to invoke specific elements. We'll use the greater hexagram rituals to invoke particular planetary or zodiacal powers. But the lesser ritual of the hexagram is for just a general macrocosmic force. And what exactly that means, I think, is best answered by actually practicing it and experiencing what the ritual actually does. So there'll be 2 forms of this, the lesser banishing ritual of the hexagram and the lesser invoking ritual of the hexagram. And the only difference between them is whether or not you're tracing the triangles clockwise or counterclockwise. It's going to be performed exactly the same. The hexagrams are just drawn differently. The structure is extremely simple. We're going to begin with the analysis of the keyword. Then we'll go around to the 4 quarters and trace the 4 hexagrams, intone our rita, trace our circle, and then we'll return to the center and finish with the analysis of the keyword. So very similar structure to the lesser ritual of the pentagram, except without the portion of the archangels. The analysis of the keyword, although more complex and involved, serves at least some of the same function that the Kabbalistic cross does, of centering us and of drawing down the powers and balancing and equilibrating and drawing down the powers that we will then be able to access to create the pentagrams and to invoke the powers we need. So we can think of it as kind of charging up the self and also of balancing and then of sort of re-energizing and resetting after we're done. So very simple symmetrical structure. Let's see, sorry, Donna says, is this a real difference? I use only as LRB, LRH. You mean, is there a difference between banishing and invoking? Yeah, there's definitely a difference between banishing and invoking. One, you're calling in this power, and the other, you're banishing, you're clearing out. So we'll use, one thing that we're really going to use the lesser banishing ritual of the hexagram for is in creating a neutral working space before using like the greater hexagram rituals to invoke the planetary powers, so that we have a neutral space to work in. But you can also use the invoking ritual as just a sort of in much the same way that you would use like a lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram, as just energizing yourself and increasingly being able to access and to invoke spiritual powers. Oh yeah, thank you, Constantin. I actually meant to include this on this slide and I forgot. Yes, you should always start with a pentagram ritual before your hexagram ritual. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. So yeah, I recommend a banishing pentagram ritual first, followed by the banishing ritual of the hexagram. The idea that you're building up, you're starting with like the pentagram ritual and then building up to the hexagram ritual. If you're invoking, you could start with a lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram. If you have like a dedicated ritual space, I think it's perfectly fine to just invoke. But if not, you may want to do like a banishing ritual first, and then work with an invoking ritual after you've like established your space and made it sure it's sort of neutral and cleared out. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And we can think of that idea of sort of building, you're working with you're setting the microcosmic world in place before then beginning to work with the macrocosmic. All right, so here's our instructions for the lesser ritual of the hexagram. Let's see, I also have a video of myself performing this. Did you guys really want to see the video first and then we'll talk through the instructions, or you want to talk through the instructions and then watch the video? I don't know what would be more helpful. Anyone have any thoughts? Video first, okay. Let's hope this works. All right, so what I'm going to do here is, because I can't get the sound to play through, I'm going to play the video here, and then I'll do a live dub over the top of it. Let me shut off my video to make the bandwidth a little better here. And so you only have to look at one of me at once. All right, so you should all be seeing the video now. Yep, looks like it's working. A couple notes here. Normally I would be robed for this. I figured without the robe, it's a little easier to see the gestures that I'll be making. You can do this with I don't recommend doing it with a dagger. You can do it with a wand or empty-handed. You can just use your like pointed index finger if you're doing it empty-handed. I'm here using a version of the wand called sometimes called like the outer order wand, where it has a black end and a white end. You use the black end to banish and the white end to invoke. And so I'm going to be performing the lesser banishing ritual of the hexagram here. And so yeah, I'll play the video and I will talk along with it. Here we go. The dagger, you can experiment with it. It's just really not traditionally done to perform it with the dagger. It's really traditionally performed with the wand. You know, honestly, now that you asked the question, I can't think of like a really great reason. Because if you're doing a lesser I definitely wouldn't do an invoking ritual with the dagger, since the dagger is associated with you know, with banishing. Yeah, I guess it's sort of traditional. I honestly can't think of a great reason off the top of my head. Well, there's the air dagger, but there's also like a generalized banishing dagger. It's one of those things, yeah. Anyways, here we go with the video. I-N-R-I, Yod, Nun, Resh, Yod. Virgo, Isis, Holy Mother. Scorpio, Apophis, Destroyer. Sol, Osiris, Holy Father. Isis, Apophis, Osiris. The sign of Osiris. The sign of the dance of Isis. This is the sign of the ecstasy of Apophis. The sign of the shining star. LVX, looks, the light of the true cross. I-N-R-I, Yod, Nun, Resh, Yod. Virgo, Isis, Holy Mother. Scorpio, Apophis, Destroyer. Sol, Osiris, Holy Father. Isis, Apophis, Osiris. The sign of Osiris. Sign of the dance of Isis. The sign of the ecstasy of Apophis. The sign of the shining star. LVX, looks, the light of the true cross. All right, so let's get the presentation back here. I'll turn the video back on. All right, so yeah, about the dagger thing. Yeah, again, it's not sort of traditionally done. It would feel odd to me to do it with a dagger, but you know, feel free to experiment if you'd like to try it with a dagger. Did I stand on tiptoes for the sign of Apophis? I did. And I was going to say, if that's difficult for you to balance, I did a few years of martial arts training a few years ago, and before I had done that martial arts training, I was not able to balance very well up on the balls of my feet. But after doing it, now I can do it comfortably. So if you have trouble balancing, just stay on the flat of your feet. That's perfectly fine. I think that's not going to harm anything. But if you can comfortably balance, you know, up on the balls of your feet, you know, it helps to emphasize that like upward sort of stretching motion. Yeah, Jason, that's certainly correct. I was thinking I definitely wouldn't use the dagger for like a lesser invoking ritual of the hexagram. I was just trying to think of a reason not to use it for the lesser banishing ritual of the hexagram. Yeah, I mean, maybe there's something about the idea that sort of criticizing or analyzing sense is something that applies more to like microcosmic powers rather than macrocosmic powers. But honestly, that's something I'll have to think about more. If I come up with anything clever, I'll let you all know in 2 weeks. But anyways, I know we're already over time, so thanks everybody for your patience. But here's just the instructions for the lesser ritual, the hexagram. So standing upright in the center of your temple, facing east. If you're using a wand or a dagger maybe, it's held in the right hand on the center line of the body. And then you will say, now notice I'm not vibrating all of these words. In the analysis of the keyword, iao is the only thing that's being vibrated. For my performance here, I just said it more directly. When I actually practice this ritual, it becomes a little bit more like chanting or something like that. It has a different sort of quality that I find effective, but you can start off with just speaking it, in a solemn sort of ritualized tone. Anyways, so then you will say, I-N-R-I, Yod, Nun, Resh, Yod, Virgo, Isis, Holy Mother, Scorpio, Apophis, Destroyer, Sol, Osiris, Holy Father, Isis, Apophis, Osiris, and then intone or vibrate Iao. Then you'll give the sign of Osiris, and keeping the point of the wand upright, you'll say the sign of Osiris. Then you'll give the sign of the dance of Isis and say the sign of the dance of Isis. You'll give the sign of the ecstasy of Apophis and say the sign of the ecstasy of Apophis. Again, keeping the wand upright throughout all of this. Then you'll say, cross the arms in the breast and say the sign of the shining star. Then you'll extend your arms again, like in the sign of Osiris, and then cross them again, saying LVX, looks, the light of the true cross. I think I recross my arms on my breast. I say LVX, looks, and then recross my arms and say the light of the true cross. But exactly how you time that is perfectly up to you. And I do it a little smoother and more overlapped when I actually do it. I did it a little bit more like segmented and mechanically for the demonstration here. All right. So steps 2 through 7 there are the analysis of the keyword. So now you'll go to the east of your circle. You'll trace the hexagram of air, either banishing or invoking, in the east, visualizing it in golden light. Each time you're just going to point the wand. I like to take a little bit of a step forward to emphasize that like forward projective sort of motion, but that's optional. So each time you're just going to point your finger or the wand to the center of the figure. So for this, it's like the place where the two lines that join, the two triangles overlap here, and you'll intone Ararita, or the full phrase if that's something you're interested in doing. Then you'll trace your circle around to the south, and you can imagine the circle being traced in that same golden light. Then you'll trace the hexagram of fire, either banishing or invoking. Point your implement, to the center of that figure, which is more or less the center of the baseline of the upper triangle, and you'll intone Ararita. Continue to the west, and you're going to trace the hexagram of water. Point the wand to now this one, the center is where the points, the triangles join. So you'll point to that point and intone Ararita. Then trace the circle to the north. Point the wand to the center of the hexagram that you've traced and intone Ararita. And then finish the circle, trace it around to the east so that the circle ends back where it began. Then return to the center, hold your implement in the center again, and repeat the analysis of the keyword. Let's see, a book for reference here. A really great reference here is David Shoemaker's Living Thelema. He includes all these instructions. I'll put these slides up on the forum for members, and for any non-members, I'll provide my contact information in just a minute, and I can send you like a Google Drive link if you'd like to use this set of slides for reference. But David's chapter in Living Thelema is a great resource for this as well, and has some interesting discussion about it. And he also talks about like the possibility of vibrating the full phrase as well. So that's another great resource. So you can check out his book. I I don't know if he ever did he do an episode about hexagram rituals? It's been so long now since I actually listened to them. But if he has a recorded, like, episode of the podcast about him, you could listen to that as well. But again, I'm happy to share my slides as well. So for the next 2 weeks, I recommend that you do some practice with the lesser ritual, the hexagram. You could learn the banishing form first, is always good advice. And then once you're feeling comfortable with the banishing form, then you could give some tries to the invoking form as well. Because learning the analysis of the keyword, learning to intone aurorita, drawing and visualizing the hexagrams, this will really give you the core of what you'll need for doing the greater ritual of the hexagram. So getting this stuff down, memorizing it and learning it will then allow you to build on this and be able to work with planetary and zodiacal powers. So you can think of this as kind of like training. If you're wondering about what the purpose of the lesser ritual of the hexagram is, one way of thinking of it is just like a kind of elementary training in working with macrocosmic forces and getting the basic structures down that will then be able to reconfigure to work with specific planetary and zodiacal powers. I will put the video up on YouTube in the next couple of days. It'll go up, definitely. And again, I'll share the slides on the forum for members, and I'm happy to share them with non-members as well, if anyone would like them. Also, we'll start to look at more diagrams and things like that of the planets and the zodiacal powers. So if you don't know the glyphs, of the planets, by which I mean, like these symbols here for the planets, and then the corresponding symbols for the signs of the zodiac. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with that. But if you're not, it would be great to learn those, just because we're going to want to have diagrams and things like that, and so you want to know, what those symbols represent. So get some practice in with the lesser ritual, the hexagram, and we will reconvene in 2 weeks, and we'll start talking about the planets. So for more about the work of the Temple of the Silver Star, you can visit tots.org/FAQ. If you'd like to get in touch with me, if you have my personal email address, feel free to continue to use that. I'm just giving you my address as the provost of TOTS, the provost of the academic track here as provost@tots.org, which is way easier to remember than how to spell my last name. So feel free to use either email address. If you'd like the slides, please just shoot me an email and I'll respond with a Google Drive link. But again, members, I'll put a link up on the forum. We also have a $5 suggested donation for anyone who's not a member of either the academic or the initiatory track. And if you'd like to make such a donation, you can send it via PayPal to payments@tots.org. For anyone listening to this video on YouTube, thanks for watching. If you'd like to get updated on when new videos are posted, you can please subscribe to our channel. Thanks again for watching, and 93s, everyone.